Hi guys, Dino here. I'm back again with another Is the Music Good video. For my long-term viewers who might be watching, we're not covering any Tekken music today, but Tekken 3 will be the next video in this series. Your patience will be rewarded. It just takes a little longer. Before I start with my usual intro, I want to include a few very important disclaimers. The game we'll be covering in this video is for adult audiences only. It contains depictions of extreme violence, gore, sexual violence, and many other similarly grotesque things. I will not include any of these depictions in this video, nor will I describe any of them or make any specific references. Just know that if you choose to play this game, you will see some of that stuff, and if you watch other videos about this game, you will see some of this stuff. If you're sensible to any of these topics and you don't wish to see nor hear about them, watching this video will be fine, just be cautious with content around this game in general. Also, I'll try to keep this video as spoiler-free as possible, but most soundtracks are tied to specific in-game locations and events, so there will be some spoilers. I mean, you clicked on an OST review for a rather niche horror game, you've probably played this game more than I have, but you've been warned. Back to the script. In this series, we discuss the soundtracks or OSTs from various video game titles and ask the following question. Is the music good? What's good is purely subjective in my eyes, so in these videos I'll share my opinion and try to offer some insight into why I enjoy certain things about the music and others not so much. Today we're listening to Fear and Hunger. Let's get started. Fear and Hunger is a survival horror game disguised as a dungeon crawler RPG. The game has you choose one of 4 starting characters to maneuver through the otherworldly depths of this dungeon, your goal being to find a certain person and recover them from this horrifying abyss. Depending on who you choose as your character, your motives for this journey will vary wildly, however the challenges will remain mostly the same. The world you enter in this game is dark and cruel. The creatures you encounter have fallen prey either to the blind faith and brutal gods of the past, or the endless, insanity-inducing darkness of the depths. Food is scarce, as are sources of light. With every passing moment in the dark, your character is driven closer to madness, while the constant battle against hunger renders them weaker and weaker. Sounds like fun, doesn't it? I actually just recently started playing this game, and while it's not insanely long, it does offer a lot of replayability for 2 reasons. 1. You die all the time in this game. One of the main aspects of the game loop is to die to something you could not have possibly predicted, memorize it for next time and start over. And 2, each character has multiple endings, depending on how you play through the game and how you handle certain decisions. As of writing this sentence, I have yet to finish a run in this game, but I think I'm kinda close to the end. Let's see how this develops over the next week or 2 as I write the remainder of the script. When we analyze music, it is necessary to consider the context which the music is written for. In the case of a survival horror dungeon crawler like Fear and Hunger, the soundtrack participates strongly in building the atmosphere of the game and world it is set in. The music of games of the genre is typically more on the subtle side for the majority of the time. Usually we won't be listening to what we traditionally call music, but maybe some ambient sound effects instead, with specific tracks and segments that break out of the quiet, eerie vibe and present something more threatening, often with spontaneous, loud sounds. The credits for the OST are easy to track down this time. I'll just read out what the developer has written in the description of the OST here on YouTube. All the tracks are made by Miro, aka Orange, except for the track Ghostpocalypse 5 Apotheosis, which is by Kevin MacLeod. MacLeod? MacLeod? Yeah, probably right. I've used a lot of samples that were made by Taira Komori, so all the credit to him where it's due. Also, many Looploft samples and freesound.org sound effects were used together with my awesome to terrible music composing skills and guitar playing. Let's take a look at the actual OST now. There are 17 tracks in the original OST uploaded on YouTube, as well as 4 missing tracks that were uploaded a few years later, so 21 tracks in total. It doesn't sound like much, but the last video was over 40 minutes long, so strap yourself in and get comfortable. Also, I think I should mention this before we dive into it. I know this game takes a lot of inspiration from many other franchises, a lot of them being horror titles. Since I'm too chicken shit to play horror games, I'm not familiar with most of them, and if there are any references within the soundtracks themselves, I will probably miss them. I apologize in advance, but hey, if you see any relations to other horror games or other titles in general, make sure to mention them in the comments. I'd love to learn more about OSTs I have no clue of. Let's take a listen. Number 1. Ghostpocalypse 5 Apotheosis. This is the intro cinematic music, and this track does one thing really well. Set the mood for the uniquely terrifying experience you'll have playing this game. During its short 32 seconds, it manages to build up an insane amount of tension, basically out of thin air. It sounds like you suddenly snapped out of a thought, or even a dream, only to quickly realize what nightmare you find yourself in. The horn-like sounds that crawl into the spotlight give me a strong feeling of panic. Like if I suddenly had to act but didn't know what to do or where to go. On the other hand, they kinda sound like they're actually drawing me in. Like the horns are in the distance, calling me from far away to seek out whatever they are announcing. It sounds contradictory, but in my eyes it really resembles the feeling of the overall game wonderfully. You probably know what you're getting yourself into once you choose to boot up Fear and Hunger, but something about this cruel and unforgiving world makes you want to dive deeper, to explore the next layer of the dungeon on your relentless mission to find Lagarde. There's this low staccato-like sound, traveling from the background straight into your ears and then backs off again. It really aids in inducing a healthy amount of anxiety into the listener. It almost sounds like the pulse of a rapidly beating heart. Really nice sound design. I believe this track achieves exactly what it's supposed to, and it doesn't waste a single second to do so. Great work. Number 2. Fear and Hunger. Okay, so this is the music you hear in the main menu. You'll have a lot of chances to listen to this one, since you'll land in this menu every time you die. This piece is very subtle. It doesn't try to lure you in, let alone scare you with aggressively loud sounds. It takes a bit more time to build up some tension, and it does so mostly by slowly introducing the various instruments over time. Well, it's still a bit shy of 2 minutes, but it certainly feels a lot longer compared to number 1. There are 2 main elements in this piece, and they are not even notes played by instruments. First, we have a sound of a rock hitting something and then splitting into multiple smaller crumbles. Maybe it resembles a rock being thrown down a deep hole, like I did a lot during my first run. Maybe that hole resembles the depth and darkness of this game that you will have to blindly jump into, not knowing when and how it's going to tear you into many little pieces. Or maybe it's a metaphorical sound of you hitting rock bottom again, being brought back down to earth. The other component is this windy sound, and that's quietly howling in the background from the very start, and gets increasingly louder as the piece progresses, until only this sound remains and finally creeps back into obscurity. The piece also includes a guitar. I suppose it's an acoustic with steel strings, but it's a bit difficult to identify since it's rather quiet. After a few bars, we can also hear a piano, laying out some rather compact chords, just enough to give the music a bit more density and add some eeriness. After a certain point, only the piano, which is slowly fading away, and the windy sound remain. The tune takes the latter half to fade out, allowing itself to loop back from the beginning. Considering that this is kind of the main theme of the game, it needs to be unique and recognizable, and I'd say that the creator managed to do both. It sounds both starved and terrified in a way. Excellent tune. Number 3. Eastern Wind. I want to preface my comment on this track with this comment by @WoodDavis. The music tries to start but just gets drowned out by the wind. Such a great opening track to set the tone for the rest of the game. Beautifully written. I agree, this tune really does a fantastic job of sending you off into the dungeons. It plays when you start the game and choose a character, and you're met with a short introduction of who you are, where you come from, and why you're about to go on this life-changing journey. We're met with the piano string sound of the previous piece that appears very rarely, while the rest of the music is just the wind. Its constant blowing is cold and solitary, yet somehow calming. On one hand, it's telling me how comfortable it would be to stay in the open, where there is daylight, to protect my sanity. On the other hand, there's this occasional howling that acts as a warning of what is about to happen should you fall for this treacherous notion of safety. I'm left with no choice really, and the wind knows. Maybe it's mocking me. What I really want to compliment here is how well the balance between actual quote-unquote music and the sound effects is selected. This will probably be the case in more tracks, since this is not uncommon for the horror genre, but this tune stands out in that regard. Really well made. Number 4. Minor Terror. Clocking in at 4 minutes and 3 seconds, this is the longest of the bunch. Minor Terror plays as background music for most of the early and mid-game, and the first half is rather subtle. We have a few different sounds at play here, some very low, rumbling sounds, accompanied by some soft chords that sound very ominous. There is also the sound of water dropping slowly, indicating that we are somewhere deep in a cellar or a cave. Occasionally, a static-like noise, followed by a high tinnitus sound, break out of the otherwise cautious track. The second half amps up the intensity gradually. The low, pulsating sound gets increasingly louder, and strangely enough, we can hear some throat singing, possibly referencing a certain group of characters in the game. Near the end, there is also a stomping sound creeping up. It gives me the impression that something in the distance is going on, just close enough to make me both curious and frightened. The rumbling noise is still very present and helps to round off this strange soundscape. I really enjoy that this tune takes its time to develop fully. There are no spontaneous outbursts of loudness to shock you and make you afraid, but this track doesn't need any of that. Its purpose is to create a fitting atmosphere for certain areas in the game, and I'd say it does a pretty good job at it. Number 5. Basement of Flies. This one is also heard as background music for the first few layers of the dungeon. That's what I think, at least, watching some gameplay footage on YouTube. I'm not sure when the game alternates between Basement of Flies and Minor Terror. Maybe it's just random, or maybe they are tied to more specific locations, but it doesn't matter. The first thing you can hear is an actual fly, so at least the name is on point. We have some soft percussion creating a steady rhythmic groove, sounds like a maraca or something similarly rattling. Not really sure what to make of this sound, it doesn't really evoke any specific emotion in me. As the music ramps up, we can hear more sounds creeping in. A bell-like sound that reminds me of someone hitting empty metal pipes, playing a slow, eerie melody. There's also other notes, fading in and out of the soundscape, seemingly at random. This might come as a surprise, but this one is probably my least favorite track so far, as I think this piece might have benefited from being a little longer. It feels like the track wants to go somewhere around the middle, but just as you can feel the terror crawling out of the shadows, it vanishes almost instantly. That might have been an intentional choice, since you'll likely listen to this on loop while playing the game, but in terms of listening to it like this, it's sadly not as convincing as its predecessors. What do you think? Do you enjoy Basement of Flies? Tell me in the comments. Number 6. Miss Jingle. There's an area you can reach in the earlier part of this game, called the backyard. It serves as a location for a few somewhat impactful choices you can make gameplay-wise, and is also a location where the bunny masks are resident. The soundtrack is very calming, and not in an unnerving manner, at least not from the beginning. It's composed of a wind-like sound, followed by a short little melody reminding me of a glass harp with a generous amount of reverb, and a few piano notes acting like an echo. After a certain point, this calming atmosphere is interrupted by a loud stomping. However, the melodies continue their tranquilizing playing, basically ignoring the hefty steps of what's probably a bass drum. I gotta say, this aspect of Miss Jingle feels weird. I don't really see the reason to include this drastic twist in the musical energy. As a listener, I don't think the tune really benefits from this. I might be missing something here, but from how I experienced this area while playing through the game, the otherwise soothing, almost sedative aspect of this piece was a very nice fit for the backyard. I guess if you don't spend a lot of time there looking around, you might not even hear the end of this track. Still, a peculiar choice in sound design. Number 7. Muted Aggression. This is the music you'll listen to while fighting regular enemies. Well, as regular as enemies can be in this game anyway. You'll be listening to this quite a lot, depending on how well you manage to avoid the encounters in the dungeon. The track's main component is the drumming, while someone seems to be fixing pipes in the background. However, that's very subtle in the mix. We also get a few low bass notes floating around, making everything a bit thicker and the overall piece more impactful. At the end, we're met with a rather abrupt climax as two additional components enter the stage. We have a much more audible bass that has some synth sawtooth characteristics. You know, that sort of farting sound, making it very aggressive and penetrating. On top of that, we also have what I believe to be a steel drum, playing some higher notes. This is an interesting choice in instrumentation, since I could see a connection between the quieter noises we can hear at the beginning of the track and the similar timbre of the steel drum. That aside, however, I don't think that this combination of sounds is very convincing. The repeated and fast drumming on the toms does evoke a feeling of panic and urgency. I know I'm repeating myself, but it sounds like a very fast heartbeat, which can be said about any kind of fast, repeated, percussive sound, but, well, it is true. Overall, I'd say this track is alright, nothing too fancy, and the ending is a bit more questionable in my eyes, and I would have liked to have something more anxiety-inducing in it, since every encounter in this game can be potentially run-ending, but it's not bad by any means. Number 8. The Four Apostles. Now this is some tense combat music. You'll hear this anytime you find enemies that are, well, not so regular. This track also features some strong drumming, starting off with a fat bass drum and then adding some toms and a snare. The strong rhythmic presence of the drum kit does stand out quite a bit considering the preceding tracks, and I do like it. It adds intensity in a very different way. The most recognizable part of this is probably the high noise that is repeated constantly, being way louder than anything else in the mix and perfectly encompassing the danger you find yourself in if you can hear it. Around the middle and again at the end, there is some creature roaring or moaning at the center of the soundscape, basically taking over the spotlight for a brief moment. It induces a bit of extra fear, which is always good. Additionally, I need to mention this scratching sound, which can be heard from the very beginning. I didn't even notice it while playing the game, since I had to turn down the volume quite a bit to, you know, not die of a heart attack. The sound is almost a bit annoying, but fits really well into how I think the characters must feel every time they encounter one of many abysmal creatures in the dungeons of fear and hunger. I really enjoy this track. Every time it came up in my playthrough, it had a crazy impact on my experience. That repeating high sound has become synonymous with sheer helplessness in my mind. The drumming really helps add more layers to it, which I think is very important for a piece that is supposed to be as imposing as the Four Apostles. Great stuff. Number 9. God of the Depths. As seems to be common for Fear and Hunger tracks, we have two halves in this track with varying degrees of tension. At first, we only hear a single repeated bass note, which could also be heard as some sort of pulse, even though it's rather slow and a bit irregular this time. I quite like this interpretation, considering the name of this piece. Accompanying the bass is a rather quiet, static noise, sort of filling in the gaps. During certain parts we can hear some kind of roaring, possibly another reference to the title. It's not insanely loud, perhaps because it's not intended to frighten the player, at least not in the way that the previous track does. It is definitely eerie and makes you want to proceed cautiously, but offers a nice contrast to the louder sections of this OST. The water drops are a familiar sound by now and aid in selling me on the setting of this music, since this music is played as background music when you're in the mines. The second half ramps up the tension immensely. A few synth notes fade in and out quite quickly, resembling the overwhelming depth you're supposed to feel from this music. They're quite alarming in a way, but the fact that they vanish into the nothingness immediately after introducing themselves is most convincing. To me, it feels like the first half of this track is me just trying to maneuver my way through the darkness, And then in the second half, finally realizing just how immense and vast this void actually is. I like it. Number 10. Creaking Throat of a God. The name is very fitting here. Most of this track is, in fact, just creaking noises, usually not too loud, except for a few occasions near the end where they really take the spotlight. However, there is a very, very low note roaming underneath, sometimes disappearing into the background only to be attacked with more force a few seconds later. It's so low in fact that I actually wondered how close it might be to the lower limit of human hearing. I mean, it's still clearly audible, but you can really feel the weight of the low frequency. Considering that this is the background music for the thicket area, I liked a very minimalist approach here. I could elaborate more thoroughly, but I don't want to include any major spoilers here. The game is really fun when you give it a shot. Number 11. Tomb of the Gods. We're introduced to the tomb yet again with a low rumbling and bell sounds. After a while, some quiet singing with lots of delay appears from the shadows and follows the typical fade-in, fade-out process. While the bells create a very mystical vibe, the singing has a nostalgic component to it. It feels like the voices are remnant from past times, when the gods had a strong presence in the world, and its siren-esque singing from afar is supposed to remind you of their long-forgotten glory. At the same time, the occasional high-pitched feedback noise adds a layer of anxiety, just enough to make you appreciate the place you find yourself in, but also to remain cautious. In the last third of this tune, two more elements are added. On one hand, we have a faster melody played by an instrument that I can't quite identify, and more bell-like sounds, this time reminding me of a headless tambourine. As the other sounds slowly fade away, only the tambourine remains, keeping its rhythm for a little bit longer. This is an interesting structural choice, and when I listen to this, I get the impression that I'm snapping out of a daydream, in which I was imagining the gods at the height of their power, only to realize that, after all, this is no more but an old, dusty tomb, their final resting place. Overall, I like this one a lot. A shame I didn't hear it much during my first playthrough. Number 12. Ancient City. After an excruciatingly long journey through the depths of this dungeon, you finally open the gates and arrive at this place. Long gone, but not forgotten. As you step through the narrow streets of this old town, you can still hear the low rumbling from the tomb. I like to think that, at least in these parts of the game, this rumbling noise resembles the power and influence that the gods hold over these places. Maybe it could also resemble whatever power lies behind the cube of depths and machinery that allows you to travel between the old and the new. We also get the feedback noise from the previous track, as well as the water dropping sound from the earlier pieces, creating some continuity. There is a subtle melody ringing in the background, decently audible but barely in the spotlight. All of this has a similar energy to the tomb, an ancient place left to rot behind these gates. Wandering these streets, you know that this has once been a city of glory and prosperity, but most of that has vanished. The most notable component here is probably the rock-shattering sound from the main theme of the game. In some other videos, people might have already mentioned how the sound of the rock shattering becomes synonymous with dying and starting over. The fact that the same sound appears on this track, much more frequently than in Fear and Hunger even, creates a strong sense of danger in my mind. I'm so used to this sound as the consequence of death, failure, and it seems like in this ancient city, death lies behind every corner. This is a pretty nice track that hits the right spot to sell me on its location. It's not my favorite by any means, and it's also nowhere as iconic as some of the others, but it does the job very well. Number 13. Endless Loop. This track is basically a nightmare OST, as you find yourself in the uneasy dream sequences of the main characters. Roaming around the sinister streets of Rondon or the Old Guard forests, you find your way through various unpleasant memories. Endless Loop starts off with a whistling sound, which reappears throughout the whole track in many variations. It creates an image of hearing illusions or ghosts, suddenly disappearing into thin air immediately after noticing them, which fits the stage for this music very nicely. We have a very low, pulse-like bass sound that fills the whole panorama, while the piano occasionally plays a few low notes to create an additional layer of sound. Near the end, the pulse seems to grow stronger and stronger. To me, this sounds like I'm hearing my own pulse while I'm dreaming, as if I physically dived into my own brain to reach this unholy place. I like it a lot. It really sets the tone for this section of the game, and even when listening to this track on YouTube, I remember exactly how I felt when I entered Rondon for the very first time. Number 14. Mahabra Streets. This track plays when you travel back to the past Mahabra, so it does lend itself to some comparison with the Ancient City track. The first sound we hear is difficult to identify, but it immediately reminds me of time travel in a way, which is of course perfect for this track. The sound reappears quite often during the first part of the tune, while we can also hear a nice little piano melody. The melody is very short and calm, and in a way has a very nostalgic quality to it. The whispering/talking noises we can hear underneath it add a very uneasy feeling, turning the sense of nostalgia into something more bittersweet. As if you were reliving memories of the past, but something was just wrong. Around the middle of this piece, the piano fades away as only the whispers remain. We can hear percussive sounds entering the stage, and to me they sound like someone was hitting empty pots or bottles with a stick. Maybe even the barrels and boxes you'll find on the Mahabra streets. Regardless, it does create a unique contrast to the first half. Since this track is rather short, you will listen to this quite a lot during a playthrough, so it needs to fit the stage well and also not get boring too quickly. I think the composer managed to achieve both things here. This was one of the tracks I was most familiar with going into this review, and even after listening to it closely for this analysis, I still enjoy it so much. Probably one of my favorites, and maybe one of yours too. Tell me what you think down in the comments. Number 15. Song for Torment. This piece offers quite a contrast to most others in the OST. From the get-go we can hear a clicking sound that reappears quite frequently, at least during the beginning. This is accompanied, as usual, by a low rumbling and static noise, which also reoccurs somewhat frequently. By the time you reach this place, you'll have gotten used to this kind of sound design, so you could say there is some form of familiarity present. Something that stands out in Song for Torment is the ticking of a clock, as well as steam coming out of some machinery. The steampunk aesthetic fits very nicely with the Temple of Torment, and the constant ticking of the clock makes your anxiety grow with each passing moment. Just play the game and experience it for yourself, it's quite a ride. With the ticking, we can also hear a few notes, probably on the piano, just playing along, which is the only aspect we traditionally refer to as music here. It seems like this is all you need, really, if you place all the other sounds carefully around it. Near the end, another sound appears that sounds like someone is cutting wood with a saw, and the song ends with only the clock ticking away into nothingness. Song for Torment is certainly unique, while also offering elements that are very consistent with the whole OST. I like it a lot. Number 16. The Gauntlet. The Gauntlet is an interesting track to talk about. You see, as of writing this sentence, I have not listened to this track even once. Of course I know that this track is the background music for a certain endgame area, which I didn't reach during my first run. I did spoil myself, however, reading the wiki page about the Gauntlet, simply so I can get a better understanding of the context the music is placed in. If you also haven't reached this place in the game yet, don't read about it, just play the game and you'll probably get there eventually. Back to the music. This track is very in line for the Fear and Hunger OST. We got everything covered, static noises, loud beating, imitating some kind of pulse, or even marching, depending on your interpretation. There is another sound in here that feels like I'm being called somewhere, maybe a warning, or maybe a cry for help. It's difficult to tell, but that ambivalence is what makes it even more frightening to me. This sound fades into the background near the end of the track, which evokes a feeling of uncertainty. Is the direction I'm heading towards the right one? Was coming to this place a good idea to begin with? The drumming also really builds up the tension here, but never to a point where it gets truly unnerving, always staying barely below that line, making you eager for what's to come once you reach the end of this uncanny place. Pretty good stuff. Number 17. Pulse and Anxiety. During my preparations for this video, I asked you Fungus on Reddit which soundtrack you enjoy the most. The vast majority responded with Pulse and Anxiety. Being a big fan of this track myself, these results were surprising but understandable. There are many in-game encounters that could be your first time hearing Pulse and Anxiety. This piece doesn't waste a second to tell you in what kind of danger you are. The first thing to hit your eardrums is this stupidly brutal tuba sound that's probably layered or mixed with other bass instruments. Honestly, I have a hard time identifying any instrumentation here, since this sound triggers major anxiety and makes my heart rate skyrocket. The name is very well selected. The time between these most unnerving aggressions on your ears are filled with something that sounds like being underwater. That's the best analogy I can find right now. If you haven't lost your hearing after the first 4 instances of the tuba sound, there is a short break in the music where these underwater noises are accompanied by a bass note that is played in a rather slow, regular rhythm. This serves as an easy metaphor for a pulse, yet again, even though it is a rather calm one. It appears contradictory at first, given the circumstances that caused this tune to play in the first place. However, I interpret it this way. The loud sounds at the beginning portray you with the mighty power of the gods you are about to experience firsthand. The less aggravating section between these moments might portray a desperate attempt to calm yourself, to try to keep your pulse slow and steady, to think straight and fight through your anxiety, only to be startled once again by the alarming presence of the gods standing before you. That's how I like to imagine it anyway. Maybe you hear it differently. How would you describe the effect of pulse and anxiety? Regardless, it's a brilliant track for some of the more challenging encounters in Fear and Hunger. No matter how many times I listen to it, it never ceases to impress me with how frightened I become. Simply outstanding. Number 18. The Ascension. Depending on the choices you make throughout the game, who you bring along the journey and which path you follow, you might end up in a place called the Void. As you find yourself in this almost unfathomable plane of existence, you'll wander around and see for yourself how vast this place truly is. The Ascension portrays this very accurately. The track is very minimalist, working with a few different sounds that always trade the spotlight and never interfere with one another. There are also many moments of complete silence, which feels very fitting for a place called the Void. Amidst some familiar sounds, we get to hear elements which are unique to this track. One of them being actual whale singing, which does remind me of a certain favorite album of mine. Near the end of the piece, the tension increases as the various sounds appear more frequently, along with some new ones, like the short bits of choir singing. I feel like this somewhat climactic section is placed here to remind us of what this place actually is. What you had to go through to reach it, and the weight of all of your actions and decisions on your way here. While not being my favorite, I'd say that this tune simply works well for what it is. I definitely get the impression that I'm lost in the void when I put this on, and I can remember entering it for the first time very vividly. Good stuff. Number 19. Prelude to Darkness. You finally reach your destination. You survived numerous layers of this dungeon, defeated countless horrendous creatures, defied the monumental might of the gods, and resisted both fear and hunger. After countless deaths, failed coin flips, severed limbs, and lethal infections. You're done. The fact that this piece is named Prelude to Darkness is peculiar. If you're familiar with most endings in this game, it does make sense. A lot of the possible endings might see you escape the gruesome dungeon of fear and hunger, or even ascend to unprecedented heights of power. Either way, all of what you had to go through in order to be here, you will never forget. It will always stick with you, haunt you, shape you. This is the darkness you've succumbed yourself in, and Prelude to Darkness is meant to herald this new chapter. This is quite a task for a video game soundtrack, but as soon as you start listening to this one, you will hear how much thought has gone into creating this piece. For the first time in the entire OST, we hear string instruments. The violin takes the center of the stage and plays a brief, melancholic introduction together with the other instruments, and shortly after, the guitar from the main menu music takes over. It seems to be slightly out of tune, which is a great trick to add eeriness to otherwise calm or pleasant notes. The guitar plays the same melody from the main music, albeit a little bit faster, and is then joined by the violin. This is of course an obvious callback to the start of the game, where you didn't know what was lying ahead, what kind of individual would come out of this journey. The little details, like the faster tempo, the nervous violin and the blurry effects only add to this notion. You remember what it was like, but that memory is blurry as you drifted off so far from the person that decided to step into these depths. After this short duo, the guitar finishes with a few chords that evoke a brighter, more positive feeling. Maybe you're glad you were able to escape this abysmal scenery, or maybe you're proud of your accomplishments. To me, it sounds like you did get a happy end of some sort. After all, you were able to complete the journey, but at what cost? I think it's clear that I'm a fan of Prelude to Darkness. It rounds off this OST and the overall experience of the game in such a beautiful way. My only gripe with this tune is the ending, since while I can see some message behind it, I do believe it could have ended a bit more dramatically, or at least a bit more depressingly. This would have fit even better in my eyes, but that's just me being really nitpicky. That aside, it's just perfect. After you complete a run of Fear and Hunger, no matter the difficulty or which ending you get, you will receive a notification about a surprise that awaits you if you start a new run and use one of 3 passwords to name your character. I won't go into detail here, since that would probably ruin the experience for all of you who don't know what I'm talking about. Just know that there are no jump scares or any other frightening surprises. It's more of a very funny joke that has a lot of effort behind it. This surprise comes with 2 new soundtracks, which are vastly different from the rest of the OST. So different in fact that it really doesn't make sense to compare them in any way. The extra soundtracks are decently made, with a few weird rhythmic hiccups here and there, but otherwise very nice to listen to. I'm sure these pieces are supposed to resemble the soundtracks of other games that are relevant to the joke, but I'm not familiar enough with them to specify. I wonder how much of these 2 tunes is his own recordings and arrangement, and how much of it complete sections just put together. Regardless, a very funny joke. I love these little extras you get for finishing a game, especially a game as cruel and unforgiving as Fear and Hunger. Brilliant. Alright, let's answer the title of this video. Is the music in Fear and Hunger good? In my opinion, yes, definitely. I'm not too familiar with horror game soundtracks, but playing the game and listening to the music more closely afterwards was quite an experience I can sincerely recommend. A lot of thought and care went into making these pieces of music, and even though some tracks match their respective in-game portrayal a bit more than others, I was pleasantly surprised with how fitting it actually is. I would have loved to go into more detail in many instances, which would potentially make you appreciate this OST even more, but I just cannot bring myself to include major lore spoilers in here. The game has a nice story and very cool lore, make sure to check it out if you dare to play it. It's impressive to look back and see what a strong soundtrack the game contains, especially considering that the creator doesn't seem to have a lot of experience in music making. Sure, it could have been even cooler to get a few more specific soundtracks for individual, special encounters and boss fights, but perhaps that would have taken away from the familiarity of these tunes. A lot of them work so well precisely because you get used to them playing during certain types of events, and for a rather short game like the first Fear and Hunger, 21 pieces are more than enough. Kudos to Orange for putting them together, you did a fantastic job. If you're still watching at this point, thank you so much. What do you think about Fear and Hunger? Do you like the music? Did you actually listen to it while playing the game? Or were you too scared to turn the volume up, like I was? Feel free to share your opinion in the comments. I'm really interested in what you guys think. I know this is more of a niche game, but it's amazing to see how many people found out about it very recently and are able to appreciate all of its aspects. This wouldn't have been possible without this dedicated community of you guys and various content creators contributing to push it into the spotlight. I hope I was able to offer a new perspective, maybe even another way to appreciate this game even further. There is no Spotify playlist this time, since the music is not available over there, but it is here on YouTube. You should check it out and give it the credit it deserves. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like on it, it helps me grow the channel immensely. To my subscribers and anyone else already familiar with this series, thank you for giving this video a chance and sticking through until the end. Your support is heavily appreciated. I know a lot of you guys are waiting for Tekken 3, and don't worry, it's already in progress. It will take a while though, since it has a lot of music to cover with the arcade and arranged versions, but I'm on it, I promise. And for all you fungers out there, yes, I will cover Fear and Hunger 2 Termina at some point, but to be quite frank, there are a lot of franchises I want to cover in this series, so Termina will have to wait a while. If you're generally interested in more OST reviews, subscribe to my channel and tell me which titles you'd like to be covered. I already have a lot on my list, but I'm very open to suggestions. Thanks for watching. I'll see you soon. Take care.